So Frank Campbell is the chair of the National Suicidology Training Center in Baton Rouge and developer of the Active Postvention model known as the LOSS team. Can we get him up? Pinned, I think, is the nomenclature.
I think I'm here.
There you go. Here he is. He is a dear friend, a tireless advocate for loss survivors, and just about the best person I know to start off this program. He thought I was going to just stop at the best person I know. The best person I know to start off our program. In the theme of The Wizard of Oz, he has been an anchor to me and so many others. So Frank, you want to make some welcoming remarks?
I'll be glad to. I think somebody's got to put me down on the screen unless that's something I have control over.
You're down there now.
I am?
Yeah.
Oh, I see you in my big screen, so had me confused. Okay, well, thank you, Vanessa. I appreciate that. And I want to thank the planning committee for the hard work. I know how tough it is to put these on. I remember 32 years ago, the first one, and how informative that was for me. And now I've hung around long enough to be on the first virtual conference. So I hope you all are giving yourself virtual hugs. This is a virtual hug that I've patented. So I will make $1 every time you do it. So please hug yourself. The good thing is you give a hug and you get a hug all at the same time. So I hope you give yourself at least 40 a day. That's a minimum required dose of hugs. And they're completely safe when dispersed that way. When I was asked to do the opening remarks, it was certainly clear to me that how fortunate we are that AAS, AFSP, and TAPS have continued this partnership they started several years ago. For me, it's great because I've had a chance to work with many people of all of those areas. But it also continues to, as Ronnie suggested, converge a lot of attention in one area. And survivors, believe me, survivors couldn't have had a conference this large at AAS over the last 50 years because we would have never had a room big enough to put everybody in. And it's grown a great deal. And Iris is here, and I'm hoping Larita's watching. Some of the people that were key to that first conference, I'm sure can appreciate how far and diverse this work has gone. I was very fortunate in undergraduate school when I showed up for my internship. My supervisor put me in the support group for suicide survivors my first night and told me I was a co-facilitator, which shows you how little trust you should put in any co-facilitator who's a mental health professional, because they obviously have just been assigned that job that day. But luckily, my 6th grade teacher had taught me that we should use our 2 ears and 1 mouth in that ratio. So I sat and listened a lot more than I talked. And that group gave me some healing I didn't expect to get and has been my mentor all these years later. So I haven't really worked a day in my life since I got in that group. I've just been able to be with the most wonderful mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, aunts, uncles, cousins, nieces, nephews, over 45 relationships that I've identified who were hurting enough, as Ronnie said, to find help and to have to stumble onto that help. So I was grateful all these years ago that the active postvention approach I offered in 1997 when I was president of AAS has taken root around the world, and hopefully more survivors every day are getting more chances to get help sooner rather than later. So I thought I would talk a little about lessons learned. It's kind of interesting that the Wizard of Oz would be a theme here. A couple of nights ago, I was in Point Capee Parish, which in Louisiana we have parishes instead of counties. And it's a small community, and I was spending the night there in a trailer, not a trailer that you, like a house trailer that you normally see in television after a tornado, but a pull-behind trailer. And so it was a very small thing, looked kind of like I Love Lucy back in the 50s. And when that tornado winds began to howl outside my window and the hail began to hit, and the trailer was rocking back and forth. I really thought I would see the wizard or the scarecrow at least pretty soon. And so it's ironic to me that this week for me has literally given me a chance to feel what it might have felt like to Dorothy all those years ago. The pandemic, I believe, has landed us all in Kansas. It has put us in a place where we hear on the television, we hear on radio, constantly statements that survivors seldom hear, like you are not alone. Even though it's true, most survivors, that's their really seminal moment in loss, is to have this sense of being the only person they know that's ever experienced a traumatic death, much less suicide. So that paradoxical beginning is kind of where Oz begins. And I think this healing conference has a number of you who are new to this environment. It also has many of you who have carried this torch since its inception in the Americas. And it's certainly traveled around the globe. We're fortunate enough to have partners in so many other countries and continents all around the globe, because suicide is like the pandemic everywhere. It is a global phenomenon. So at our crisis center, which is 50 years old this year, we adopted a theme many years ago that I presented along with Byron McGale at AAS called Thinking Globally, Working Locally. And that's what we've been doing. We have folks from very, very different backgrounds that come to the National Suicidology Training Center to learn different elements. And we partner with AAS and LSU, and we partner with TAPS and other groups to bring this message of learning, and especially how to support survivors. It seems ironic that postvention tends to almost always, we get to postvention by the end of the conference, or we get to postvention because people go there just for that information. So I'm grateful for this opportunity for more people around the globe to join us, because I think we might be able to change some of how survivors are approached. I think many researchers early on told me that they were scared of the grief. It's very daunting for a researcher to be with someone whose grief is so real. And I'm training mental health professionals. I've had to explain to them, if you can't take this grief, don't get into it. Don't get into this work if you can't handle it. So they were fortunate enough to be able to come and attend our groups and dip a toe in that water of grief and see if they could sustain themselves. The outcome every time is they're transformed. Just like in The Wizard of Oz, everybody's transformed. I tell people when I work with bereaved people that my job is to help you feel, not feel better. And a lot of people roll their eyes the second I say that, because they go, wait a minute, well, what am I doing here then? But the rest of the sentence goes like this: my job is not to help you feel better. My job is to help you feel. Because if you feel and tell, you will heal, and you will have done that. Finding your voice in suicide helps so much. Ronnie talked about her ability to make meaning out of her loss. And I believe that's where that begins, is when you begin to heal from the loss, and you begin to see opportunities in your healing to make meaning. And we have examples all over the place about folks who have accomplished this. The AAS award salutes that for one person, but we could give out millions of these awards every year if we had the time, because people all over the globe are making a difference. In America, every time the football is moved down the field when it comes to suicide prevention, it's been carried by survivors. And I was fortunate enough to be in the Dirksen building when we revealed the survivor quilt so many years ago and got Surgeon General David Satcher involved. So I want to mention a few things about, I guess, a couple of ideas that I would like to share with you. One is that we continue to need to reduce the stigma. And we're in a great opportunity in the pandemic because there's a lot of stigma being applied to the pandemic and to different cultures as a result of it. We're seeing parallels that have gone on with suicide survivors for thousands of years. One of the ways we're going to do that is we're going to start to address the wrongs of the past and let go of some of the terminology that has created a lot of the stigma. So if I could have my first slide up, I'd like to share a story with you. Our first slide is a photograph of a cemetery. And if you notice in the center portion, you'll see what looks like a ditch running across the cemetery the entire length. But there was a period of time, and when I was 12, my best friend shot himself. And he had been an altar boy in the church here in Baton Rouge, a respected individual, family. But he was denied the opportunity to have a mass at that time. And he was denied burial in the holy ground. And so if you go to cemeteries and notice really old established cemeteries, sometimes you'll see what this picture is revealing. And it's kind of a scar on the, I guess, the ability to be compassionate. It goes back to that time where people were denied Christian burial within sacred ground. And that represents what would have been a fence that would have fenced out those who died this type of death. And so what I believe is so beautiful about this picture is that time has changed, whether they intended it or not. And my friend today is in the middle of that cemetery because they had to move the fences to make room for more people. So regardless of how it happens, our cultures are beginning to understand more, respect the pain and sorrow that survivors experience, and instead of fencing them out, embracing them within the fence and protecting them like we would all souls. I do think suicide creates a winter of our soul experience, a time when people question greatly existential beliefs and everything about their own spiritual understanding. Doing this on your own is a much harder trek. If we get with others, just like we see in the cemetery, we'll begin to be just a community of those who have experienced life and death. So it's from this idea about 15 years ago that I started working on a workshop that TAPS was kind enough to let me present last year through Kim's National Suicidology Conference for Military Families, called Remember the Dash. And it always takes me about 10 or 15 years to get an idea to fruition. So don't be surprised that it took me that long. But if you think about every grave marker, they almost always have two traditional things on them, even if they don't have anything else. They'll have a date of birth and a date of death separated by a dash. And unfortunately with suicide, we tend to only focus on the day of death and the way of death, the manner of death. And yet we know that every person represented in this cemetery was more than the last seconds of their life. They were much more than their date of birth. Those are the milestones, the bookends, the alpha and the omega, but it's that dash that describes their life. And I think more and more, I hope we can all begin to focus on the life and not the manner of death. But for survivors, there's a lot of healing that has to happen for them to be able to not have that is the first thing they think of when they wake up and the last thing that keeps them awake at night. So I know that out there in our communities, we're struggling to get more and more support going, but peer support works. And we've got to find ways to train folks to be great peer support advocates and also to be able to help others and not just cry together, but to heal together. And the other slide I have is a beginning point that I think all of us can be a part of changing. So if I can have the next slide. This is my attempt to suggest, that's Donna's slide, so maybe go, there we go. This is in order to not pay the Ghostbusters people for coming up with the logo. I made this so it's a little ugly. But I'm trying to take that word committed out of our language. When we had our first conference 32 years ago, I remember this being something that was barely talked about. And that as presenters, one after another, would get up and use committed suicide together, it just began to be like fingernails on a chalkboard. We've got to lose this word. We've got to find a voice to say to all those who continue this archaic use of the term to drop it, to grow up, face the reality that the word suicide says everything. And I love the fact that Living Works has begun to spread through their trainings the idea of conjugating suicide into suicide, suicided, and suiciding. Because the great thing about conjugating it that way, it's a parallel with murder. We say murder, murdered, murdering. So it's not a different word that we have to teach people the way we've had to teach postvention not to be hyphenated. What we can say about suicide is that everyone understands what the meaning of the word is. It doesn't need modification. And that suicided means that they have died, and suiciding means that they might be in the act of dying. Whereas if you talk to suicidologists, and I've talked to a few, no one can even agree on what ideation means. No one could agree on what suicide in progress means. And so we have this Tower of Babel still around language. So I'm for now, before we can find words we all agree on, let's find words we agree to get rid of. And I think this is one of those. And that's something all of us can do. It's a little brave of you sometimes to tell the reporter that's interviewing you to not use the word. But if you do it 10 times, I promise you, it will get easier. And what you're doing is you're meeting someone who's not aware, and you're leaving them more aware when they go. You may be using this word too. Everybody I know that came to this loss used this word. But what you begin to do by saying to others to drop it is you lose it yourself. And it's one piece of baggage we can all help get rid of. So on your way to the wizard, I hope you surrender this word. I always love that part of the Wizard of Oz where the scarecrow goes to the wizard and the wizard says, "You want me to show you that you have a brain, or you want a brain?" He said, "The only thing that differentiates you with scholars is they have a piece of paper that says they have a brain." You all have brains, and you all have hearts like the lion, and you all have the courage of the lion and the heart of the 10 men. And what we can all do together is find ways to click our heels and ask people to understand this word is no longer needed. Just like fences to separate the dead from those who die by suicide. We've got to find a way in the future to take this knowledge and share it with others as a beginning step of reducing stigma. Stigma, shame, hypervigilance, those are all immediate events for someone who loses someone to suicide. Today we have an event that allows you to focus on healing and your own transformation and your own ability to cope. I believe we have a great opportunity with the pandemic. Every crisis theory says that in every crisis there's danger and opportunity. The opportunity is the survivors have been dealing with their own pandemic for years. Now we can help others learn how to deal with this pandemic while we also embrace that pandemic. You can be alone and not be isolated. When my friend died at 12, our teacher told us at dismissal that day, and as a group of kids, we felt all alone together. And those of us that are still alive today still remember where we were standing. So when Ronnie described standing at the top of the stairs, I can tell you where I was standing on the playground and what I was wearing, because that is the imprint of suicide. Let's remove some of the negative imprints so that we can remember the dash. I welcome you all here today. We thank our sponsors and all those who made this day possible. But most important is all of you that are here today. Thank you and welcome to the day's conference.
Thank you so much, Frank. And it looks like we've got those beautiful talk, and thank you. I love your AAS Healing Day behind you too. Everybody's been commenting on it. Thank you.
That's right. Joe McMahon gave me those letters years ago, and I have to change them all the time. Sometimes I misspell the words too.
You have both some letters and a heart and a brain. And I thank you so much for everything you've done for survivors since the day you started working.
Thank you.
Okay. Do we have any questions for a few minutes? Maybe we can have a bit of a discussion. Somebody spoke about the term murder-suicide and what we think about that term, because unfortunately that occurs.
It does occur. It's an accurate term. Some people don't like the word murder. Homicide would be, as an assistant coroner, you're going to do a homicide and you're going to do suicide. But on a similar tangent, think about when George W. Bush was president. We had one Fox interview where we got him to say homicide, suicide, instead of suicide bomber. And that's because the term suicide bomber was so misrepresentative of what we certainly realize about suicide, because the main intent in that is all about killing others. I don't think in murder-suicide it is all about killing others. I think it's a leveraging behavior, but it is unfortunately the same kind of terms the media continue to use to communicate something to them or for them. And what it becomes is this shorthand that ignores most of the real relevance of how this goes about happening. For family members who came to grieve, I would say those who had experienced the suicide of a loved one who then murdered other members of their family prior to their own suicide, said on a regular basis how hard it was to relate to the suicides in the room, because they had both feelings of ambivalence. Well, so do the suicide survivors, but oftentimes you have to put that out there. You have to put that out there that you both love and are angry at the loved one. And so when they could do that, they found more connection in the group. But that's what facilitation in a group can do. It can help us see that opposites are true. And when it comes to suicide, I don't know any more paradoxical cause of death. Even murder-suicide, as opposite as that is.
Thank you, Frank. And here's one that I think that a lot of people are probably feeling. And anyone can answer. Ronnie, you can answer as well. Can anyone help with the fact that we truly didn't know our son was depressed? The guilt we feel about not being able to help him is unbearable. We feel like rotten parents who can't even figure out that something was going on in his life and he couldn't even tell us.
Well, I find there's a great many stories that, suicide. Ed Schneiderman, I'm grateful that he was a mentor of mine. Ed Schneiderman used to say, suicide is an N of one. And that's what gets lost in all the data. The data mean nothing each year if your loved one didn't die that year. If your loved one died that year, then that data might be of value. But it's still that N of one. And on a regular basis, I find it very hard to hear depression as the only characteristic behavior for that person. In fact, I hear quite a number of other very normal things going on for people. And this whole idea of warning signs has been, I think, a bad thing for us, because we expect a warning sign to occur just before death, just like we have stop signs at intersections. And the reality is people get up from a table planning a fun vacation, laughing and having fun with their family, go 12 feet into another room and take their life. And there is no warning sign. There is no intersection. Carla's book has often pointed out how Harry was doing everything that you would expect a person grieving the loss of their parents to do. And yet he all the while might be planning his death. William Styron, we did some workshops together, Bill Styron and I, and Mike Wallace. And Styron said, the night he gets a Pulitzer Prize, he's celebrating with his family while all the time planning later that night he might take his life. We need to have these deeper conversations so that people aren't constantly replaying the last times they saw their loved one and saying, what did I miss? Because in the rearview mirror, we can make those look like billboards. Going forward in life, probably for every dying clue we see in the rearview mirror, there would have been 9 living clues presented simultaneously. And why would we pay more attention to that one dying clue when there were 9 living clues that contradict it? That's what I think is so painful for survivors, is to see ratios and data that suggest, oh, it's always this group. When it comes to depression, 90% of the people with clinical depression will not die by suicide. About 10% will. So that means that we'd have a 9-to-1 false positive situation if we looked at depression. The reality is quite a few people without depressive symptoms or would qualify for a diagnosis of depression will die by suicide. When we do psych autopsies, it's very difficult to find depression highly represented, and most of us don't know what depression really looks like anyway.
Thank you, Frank. I want to ask Ronnie Walker.
Yeah, she wants to add something.
Oh, add something, Ronnie, and then I have another question for you, Ronnie, if we can pin Ronnie.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to add on to that. You know, last September, when it was Suicide Prevention Month, I noticed that a number of people on our forum were talking about how much trouble how guilty they felt when they read the messaging of suicide is preventable. And they felt that they missed the signs, or they should have done something. They could have, should have, would have. It made them feel very guilty. And for some people, it made them feel very angry because they had seen signs and they had tried to do things, but they weren't able to. And one of the things that happened was that I actually wrote a blog article and it's still on the Alliance of Hope blog, that quoted the feelings of so many loss survivors about how they felt guilty or angry or something like that. And what came out of that was a conversation about suicide just being complicated. And so we created some memes and we sent them out based on suicide is complicated. We just changed for that month, suicide is preventable to suicide is complicated. And in the history of what we've been doing, we've never had anything that went viral to the extent that that did. My daughter Heather's in the other room and she was in charge of that campaign. I can't remember if it went to 800,000 people. The outpouring, it was shared and shared and shared and commented on and liked and loved. And it seemed as if it opened a valve in the survivor community of emotion. So whoever submitted that question, I just want them to know they're not alone. That is a pervasive feeling. People worry that they miss the signs, they feel guilty. And I know if I had a magic wand and I could do one thing, it would be simply to take that guilt away from people and let them mourn their loss. But if we could take that guilt away for feeling that they missed the signs, I'd do it in a minute.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you.
So I just want to say, somebody asked if there were thoughts on using phrases like life promotion instead of suicide prevention. And our conference that we just had, the professional side of the conference, or loss survivors, attempt survivors, everybody's welcome. But we talked about building lives worth living rather than suicide prevention. But Ronnie, there was another question in terms of funerals and memorials and what you sort of suggest to people, faith leaders that are running funerals, to help survivors, loss survivors, and how to manage those funerals. I wonder if you could take a minute or two to talk about that.
Oh, well, we do a lot of work with funeral directors so that they can get information about resources into the hands of new loss survivors. And we do have a section on our website that gives information about ways to talk about their loved one. I don't know that we're necessarily teaching funeral directors how to have a funeral. We do talk a lot to people about how to talk about their loved one, that they can be in control of the conversation, and that if somebody comes up to them and they want to speak to them, that's fine. But otherwise, feel free to say, I'm sorry, it's just too painful, I don't want to talk about it. And I also suggest that people really talk about the dash that Frank Campbell was talking about who these people were. There's a memorial wall on the Alliance of Hope with hundreds of photographs. And every time I look at it and scroll through, I'm amazed, because I would love to spend time with any one of those people that are on there. They have a beautiful depth of character. So we encourage people to talk as they feel comfortable. Either say, it's too painful, I don't want to talk about it right now, or to have the equivalent of what I call an elevator speech, that little thing that you can say in 20 or 30 seconds as you ride up in an elevator, and to prepare it in advance. So basically what I generally say, is my stepson was a brilliant young man. I don't talk about the downside of all that we experienced when he was dealing with delusions or manic episodes. I simply say my stepson was a brilliant young man. He was a junior at Stanford University when he ended his life. He had a devastating mental illness, a genetic disorder, bipolar disorder. He fought it valiantly, and then he took his life. It was a devastating loss for all of us. And almost invariably, when I'm authentic like that, I get to control the conversation. I just don't say he killed himself, or he committed suicide, or he died by suicide. I don't just say that and let people make up their own story. And so I think when we are in the midst of funerals, we can create the story. What we say creates the reality that people will take in.
Thank
So
you.
that's what I recommend. Thank you.
One more question, and then maybe we'll all take a little bit of self-care break and get some water drink before I introduce Donna and Carla. But there's a couple of questions here. And by the way, you guys, these are all amazing questions. We're not going to get to all of them. I'm going to try and answer you all back channel later when I have the time. But a couple of people have been talking about means and this idea that we're not supposed to mention means, and that there are different thoughts on that topic. And I don't know, maybe Frank, you could sort of respond to that in terms of what it's like for a survivor.
You cut out about we're not supposed to mention what?
The means of the suicide death. And also maybe there's a lot about trauma, that not only is there grief, but in terms of finding somebody, seeing somebody, they're also dealing with their trauma. So maybe if you could speak a little bit to that.
Well, I think stigma is behind the idea of not talking about suicide. I personally advocate on a regular basis that all counties and parishes ought to put out a monthly total of how many died by what manner of death and how many are unknown and undetermined, etc. So I'm for full transparency with that. We should talk about suicide the same way we do any other cause of death or manner of death. That stigma is always there when we have a secret or something we're not supposed to talk about. My goodness, look at the topics that have been opened up in my lifetime that would have been sealed forever if it would have been true in the last generation. So I'm for talking about suicide and naming it at funerals and everywhere else. The one thing we are all promised at birth is a guarantee that we will die. And until we can embrace that reality, we will continue to just be in denial of death. We'll be out there running around saying that death is not going to happen to me because I just bought a new boat, or I bought a new car, or I got a new job, or I moved to a new city. And the treatise years ago by Becker in his Pulitzer Prize winning book, Denial of Death, was that we do all of this to distract ourselves from the reality that we will die. I think if we talk about death, we'll be a lot healthier as a society. And we've said this about every social issue so far, that we need to bring it out and talk about it. Why would we not do that with this cause of death that is so big? I agree with Ronnie's comment about the challenge of saying suicide is preventable. What I believe is my neighbor might be able to help any member of my family if they're properly taught and trained and able to talk about suicide. but I might be the one most impaired to help a family member of my own. But then I might be able to help my neighbor or somebody else down the street. I think we need to recognize that this is a community, a national and an international and global problem, and that we all have a role to help. And helping people is very different than taking on that idea that suicide being the multifactorial cause of death that it is, that we're going to have all the knowledge to do everything. What we can do is listen. And what we have not supported is listening as a powerful intervention, and it is. Now, what was the other part of that question you had? You added.
I can add something, Frank, if it's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the questions that Vanessa was asking too was about talking about the means of death and how they died and kind of those details and the trauma associated with that. We see this a lot.
Means of death. Okay.
Yes, we see this a lot at TAPS because the majority of our survivors have either witnessed the death or found the body of their loved one, which leaves along a lot of trauma that is very different and separate from the grief journey.
Absolutely.
And what we've learned is that very often our trauma survivors in the past, before we started identifying and supporting and treating trauma, is that those survivors were reclusing themselves for fear that they couldn't talk about this out loud, right? That they couldn't talk about the details, they couldn't talk about the means or the details of the death, so they're alone in that pain and that trauma and recluse themselves, and that led to other problems, you know, in their family.
Right.
So it's really, really important for people who've had that kind of trauma associated with suicide, which is really common, to reach out and get some professional help. If it's interfering with your ability to sleep, to eat, to function in your life, if you're having, you know, post-traumatic stress symptoms and anxiety that's pervasive, it's really good to get professional care. We do that with survivors, and also to build up a support group of other loss survivors who have had trauma. I mean, it's incredible the kind of healing that comes when you get trauma survivors together and they realize that they're not alone, and you can talk about some of these horrible things out loud in a safe place. And so I would say this is a big issue among survivors. And I think if you are suffering with trauma related, or if you have incidents around the death or even leading up to the death that are really painful for you, please separate that out and get treated, because that'll interfere with your grief and having your grief be a healthy grief journey. It can hold you back for years.
Oh yeah, I appreciate you clarifying, Kim, because my computer kept cutting out and it keeps going to full screen, and when it does, it says that my transmission is compromised. And I thought it was a personal statement about me, so I'm glad to know that it was just that the bandwidth gets messed up. But safe messaging should always be about how much exposure to the scene the survivor invites other people to experience, as well as re-traumatizing themselves by running over or ruminating about images. So I definitely agree. And we need to keep that conversation going about grief and trauma being two very separate psychological constructs. Grief is an emotional construct with psychological consequences, but trauma is an all psychological construct. Schneidman, in his preface to Al Kane's book in '72, has this great quote that I use a lot, and I know a lot of you are tired of hearing me say it, but I don't like to write, I like to quote other people. Schneidman said that the deceased place a psychological skeleton in the survivor's emotional closet. And that is about the grief and the struggle to understand what was going on for that person before their death. Trauma is separate from all of that. Trauma is the unintended consequences of suicide. I don't believe anybody intends, even in the most violent situations, to really, if asked and could contemplate, to visit that trauma on their loved ones. Because that's not, it's an unintended consequence of this cause of death. But when we have it, we've got to cope with it and deal with it separately. And sometimes you need a lot more help to deal with that than you would just the reality of struggling with a manner of death by suicide. Reinviting the images of the scene back or your opinion of the images of the scene back is a very dangerous thing to do over and over.
All right, thank you. I'm cognizant that we've all been sitting and looking at the screen, so I want to give us all about a 5-minute break before we come back and I get to introduce Donna and Carla. I do want to mention, I am going to go through all of these questions and get answers to them. There have been a bunch of questions about funerals, and there's a book called The Suicide Funeral by somebody from AAS, Melinda Moore. And if you go on Amazon and you Google the Suicide Funeral, it's a great resource for those of you who have questions about this. I think some of the questions are going to come up in Donna's talk and Carla's conversation with her and in Iris's closing. So let's all take a break, get a drink of water, and we'll be back in 5 minutes.